Trotsky was born in Yanavka, Kherson Province, Ukraine on November 7, 1879. He was the fifth child of a wealthy but illiterate Jewish farmer, David Leontievich Bronstein and Anna Bronstein, d. 1910. Trotsky was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein, named after an uncle who would, later that month, attempt to blow up the imperial railway carriage. Although the family was ethnically Jewish, it was not religious, and the languages spoken at home were Russian and Ukrainian instead of Yiddish. When Trotsky was 9, his father sent him to school in Odessa. He was enrolled in a historically German school, which became increasingly Russified during his years in Odessa due to the government's policy of Russification. While a good student, even in his youth Trotsky was rebellious, organizing a protest against an unpopular teacher in the second grade. Trotsky became involved in revolutionary activities in 1896 after moving to Nikolaev. At first a Narodnik, or revolutionary populist, he was introduced to Marxism later that year and gradually shifted towards Marxism. Instead of pursuing a mathematics degree, Bronstein helped organize the South Russian Workers' Union in Nikolaev in early 1897. He wrote and printed leaflets and proclamations, distributed revolutionary pamphlets and popularized socialist ideas among industrial workers and revolutionary students. In January 1898, over 200 members of the Union, including Trotsky, were arrested. Trotsky spent the next 2 years in prison awaiting trial. 2 months after his arrest and imprisonment, the First Congress of the newly formed Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, RSDLP, was held. From that point on, Trotsky affiliated himself with that party. While in prison, he married a fellow Marxist, Alexandra Sokolovskaya, and studied philosophy. In 1900 he was sentenced to 4 years in exile in Siberia, where his first 2 daughters, Nina Nevelson and Zinaida Volkova, were born. It was in Siberia that Trotsky became aware of disagreements within the party, which had been decimated by arrests in the last 2 years of the 19th century. Some social democrats known as economists were arguing that the party should concentrate on helping industrial workers improve their lot in life. Others argued that overthrowing the monarchy was more important and that a well-organized and disciplined revolutionary party was essential. The latter opinion was led by the London-based newspaper Iskra, which was founded in 1900. Bronstein quickly sided with the Iskra position. Trotsky escaped from Siberia in the summer of 1902, having stolen a passport in the name of Leon Trotsky, a former jailer in Odessa, which became his primary revolutionary pseudonym. Once abroad, he moved to London to join Georgy Plekhanov, Vladimir Lenin, Julius Martov and other editors of Iskra. Under the pen name Pero, feather, or pen, in Russian, Trotsky soon became one of the paper's leading authors. Unbeknownst to Trotsky, the 6 editors of Iskra were evenly split between the Old Guard, led by Plekhanov, and the New Guard, led by Lenin and Martov. Not only were Plekhanov's supporters older, in their 40s and 50s, but they had also spent the previous 20 years in European exile together. Members of the New Guard were in their early 30s and had only recently come from Russia. Lenin, who was trying to establish a permanent majority against Plekhanov within Iskra. Due to Plekhanov's opposition, Trotsky did not become a full member of the editorial board, but from that point on he participated in its meetings in an advisory capacity, which earned him Plekhanov's enmity. In late 1902, Trotsky met Natalia Sedova, who soon became his companion and, from 1903 until his death, wife. They had 2 children together, Leon Sedov, 1906, and Sergei Sedov, 1908. As Trotsky later explained, after the 1917 revolution, in order not to oblige my sons to change their name, I, for citizenship requirements, took on the name of my wife. However, the name change remained a technicality and he never used the name Sedov, either privately or publicly. Natalia Sedova sometimes signed her name, Sedova Trotskaya. Trotsky and his first wife, Alexandra Sokolovskaya, maintained a friendly relationship until Sokolovskaya disappeared in 1935 during the Great Purges. After a period of secret police repression and internal confusion that followed the First Party Congress in 1898, Iskra succeeded in convening the party's Second Congress in London in August 1903, with Trotsky and other Iskra editors in attendance. The Congress proceeded as planned, with Iskra supporters handily defeating the few economist delegates at the Congress. Then the Congress discussed the position of the Jewish Bund, which had co-founded the RSDLP in 1898, but wanted to remain autonomous within the party. In the heat of the debate, Trotsky made a controversial statement to the effect that he and 11 other non-Bund Jewish delegates who had signed an anti-Bund statement, while working in the Russian party, regarded and still do regard themselves also as representatives of the Jewish proletariat. As Trotsky explained 2 months later, his statement was just a tactical maneuver made on Lenin's request. Shortly thereafter, pro-Iskra delegates unexpectedly split in two factions. Lenin and his supporters, known as Bolsheviks, argued for a smaller but highly organized party. Martov and his supporters, known as Mensheviks, argued for a larger and less disciplined party. In a surprise development, Trotsky and most of the Iskra editors supported Martov and the Mensheviks, while Plekhanov supported Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The two factions were in a state of flux in 1903–1904, with many members changing sides. Plekhanov soon parted ways with the Bolsheviks. Trotsky left the Mensheviks in September 1904 over their insistence on an alliance with Russian liberals and their opposition to a reconciliation with Lenin and the Bolsheviks. From that point until 1917, he remained a self-described, non-factional social democrat. Trotsky spent much of his time between 1904 and 1917 trying to reconcile different groups within the party, which resulted in many clashes with Lenin and other prominent party members. Trotsky later conceded he had been wrong in opposing Lenin on the issue of the party. During these years, Trotsky began developing his theory of permanent revolution, which led to a close working relationship with Alexander Parvus in 1904–1907. After the events of Bloody Sunday, 1905, Trotsky secretly returned to Russia in February 1905. At first he wrote leaflets for an underground printing press in Kiev, but soon moved to the capital, St. Petersburg. There he worked with both Bolsheviks, like Central Committee member Leonid Krazin, as well as the local Menshevik Committee, which he pushed in a more radical direction. A secret police agent, however, betrayed the latter, in May. Trotsky had to flee to rural Finland, where he worked on fleshing out his theory of permanent revolution until October, when a nationwide strike made it possible for him to return to St. Petersburg. After returning to the capital, Trotsky and Parvus took over the newspaper Russian Gazette and increased its circulation to 500,000. Trotsky also co-founded Nashalo, The Beginning, with Parvus and the Mensheviks, which proved to be very successful. Immediately prior to Trotsky's return to the capital, the Mensheviks had independently come up with the same idea that Trotsky had an elected non-party revolutionary organization representing the capital's workers, the First Soviet Council of Workers. By the time of Trotsky's arrival, the St. Petersburg Soviet was already functioning with Khrustalyov Nassar, Georgy Nassar, alias Pyotr Khrustalyov, a compromise figure, at its head, and proved to be very popular with the workers in spite of the Bolsheviks' original opposition. Trotsky joined the Soviet under the name Yanovsky, after the village he was born in, Yanovka, and was elected vice-chairman. He did much of the actual work at the Soviet and, after Khrustalyov Nassar's arrest on November 26, was elected its chairman. On December 2, the Soviet issued a proclamation which included the following statement about the Tsarist government and its foreign debts. The autocracy never enjoyed the confidence of the people and was never granted any authority by the people. We have therefore decided not to allow the repayment of such loans as have been made by the Tsarist government when openly engaged in a war with the entire people. The following day, December 3, the Soviet was surrounded by troops loyal to the government and the deputies were arrested. Trotsky and other Soviet leaders were put on trial in 1906 on charges of supporting an armed rebellion. At the trial, Trotsky delivered some of the best speeches of his life and solidified his reputation as an effective public speaker, which he confirmed in 1917 to 1920. He was convicted and sentenced to exile for life. In January 1907, Trotsky escaped en route to exile and once again made his way to London, where he attended the Fifth Congress of the RSDLP. In October 1907, he moved to Vienna, where he frequently participated in the activities of the Austrian Social Democratic Party and, occasionally, of the German Social Democratic Party, for the next 7 years. It was in Vienna that Trotsky became close to Adolf Joffe, his friend for the next 20 years, who introduced Trotsky to psychoanalysis. In October 1908, he started a bi-weekly Russian-language social democratic paper aimed at Russian workers called Pravda, The Truth, which he co-edited with Joffe, Matvei Skobelev and Viktor Kopp, and which was smuggled into Russia. The paper avoided factional politics and proved popular with Russian industrial workers. When various Bolshevik and Menshevik factions tried to reunite at the January 1910 RSDLP Central Committee meeting in Paris over Lenin's objections, Trotsky's Pravda was made a party-financed, central organ. Lev Kamenev, Trotsky's brother-in-law, was added to the editorial board from the Bolsheviks, but the unification attempts failed in August 1910 when Kamenev resigned from the board amid mutual recriminations. Trotsky continued publishing Pravda for another 2 years until it finally folded in April 1912. When the Bolsheviks started a new workers-oriented newspaper in St. Petersburg on April 22, 1912, they called it Pravda as well. In what appeared to be a minor development at the time, in April 1913 Trotsky was so upset by what he saw as a usurpation of his newspaper's name that he wrote a letter to Nikolai Chkheidze, a Menshevik leader, bitterly denouncing Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Trotsky was able to suppress the contents of the letter in 1921 to avoid embarrassment, but once he started losing power in the early 1920s, the letter was made public by his opponents within the Communist Party in 1924 and was used to paint him as Lenin's enemy. This was a period of heightened tension within the RSDLP and led to numerous frictions between Trotsky, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The most serious disagreement that Trotsky and the Mensheviks had with Lenin at the time was over the issue of expropriations, i.e. armed robberies of banks and other companies by Bolshevik groups to procure money for the party, which had been banned by the Fifth Congress, but continued by the Bolsheviks. In January 1912, the majority of the Bolshevik faction led by Lenin and a few Mensheviks held a conference in Prague and expelled their opponents from the party. In response, Trotsky organized a unification conference of social democratic factions in Vienna in August 1912, the August Bloc, and tried to reunite the party. The attempt was generally unsuccessful. While in Vienna, Trotsky continuously published articles in radical Russian and Ukrainian newspapers like Kievskaya Mysl under a variety of pseudonyms, often Antid Otto. In September 1912, Kievskaya Mysl sent him to the Balkans as its war correspondent, where he covered the two Balkan Wars for the next year and became a close friend of Christian Rakovsky, later a leading Soviet politician and Trotsky's ally in the Soviet Communist Party. With the outbreak of World War I, Trotsky was forced to flee Vienna for neutral Switzerland to avoid arrest as a Russian émigré on August 3, 1914. The outbreak of World War I caused a sudden realignment within the RSDLP and other European social democratic parties over the issues of war, revolution, pacifism and internationalism. Within the RSDLP, Lenin, Trotsky and Martov advocated various internationalist anti-war positions, while Plekhanov and other social democrats, both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, supported the Russian government to some extent. Trotsky moved to France on November 19, 1914, as a war correspondent for the Kievskaya Mysl. In September 1916, Trotsky was deported from France to Spain for his anti-war activities. Spanish authorities wouldn't let him stay and he was deported to the United States on December 25, 1916. Trotsky was living in New York City when the February Revolution of 1917 overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. He left New York on March 27, but British naval officials in Halifax, Nova Scotia intercepted his ship and he spent a month detained at Amherst, Nova Scotia. After initial hesitation by the Russian Foreign Minister Pavel Milyukov, He was forced to demand that Trotsky be released, and the British government freed Trotsky on April 29. He finally made his way back to Russia on May 4 of that year. Upon his return, Trotsky was in substantive agreement with the Bolshevik position, but he didn't join them right away. At the time, Russian Social Democrats were split in at least 6 groups, and the Bolsheviks were waiting for the next party congress to determine which factions they would merge with. Trotsky temporarily joined the Mezrayantsi, a regional social democratic organization in St. Petersburg, and became one of its leaders. At the First Congress of Soviets in June, he was elected member of the first All-Russian Central Executive Committee from the Mezrayantsi faction. Trotsky was arrested on August 7, 1917 after an unsuccessful pro-Bolshevik uprising in Petrograd, but was released 40 days later in the aftermath of the failed counter-revolutionary uprising by Lever Kornilov. After the Bolsheviks gained a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky was elected chairman on October 8. He sided with Lenin against Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev when the Bolshevik Central Committee discussed staging an armed uprising, and he led the efforts to overthrow the provisional government headed by Alexander Kerensky. After the success of the uprising on November 7–8, Trotsky led the efforts to repel a counterattack by Cossacks under General Pyotr Krasnov and other troops still loyal to the overthrown provisional government at Gatchina. Allied with Lenin, he successfully defeated attempts by other Bolshevik Central Committee members, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Alexei Rykov, etc., to share power with other socialist parties. By the end of 1917, Trotsky was unquestionably the second man in the Bolshevik Party after Lenin, overshadowing the ambitious Zinoviev, who had been Lenin's top lieutenant over the previous decade, but whose star appeared to be fading. This turnaround planted the seeds of the two Bolshevik leaders' mutual enmity, which lasted until 1926 and, in the end, did much to destroy them both. After the Bolsheviks came to power, Trotsky became the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs and published the secret treaties previously signed by the Triple Entente and the United States that detailed plans for post-war reallocation of colonies and redrawing state borders. Trotsky was the head of the Soviet delegation during the peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk between December 22, 1917 and February 10, 1918. At that time, the Soviet government was split on the issue. Left communists, led by Nikolai Bukharin, continued to believe that there could be no peace between a Soviet republic and a capitalist country, and that only a revolutionary war leading to a pan-European Soviet republic would bring a durable peace. They cited the successes of the newly formed, January 15, 1918, voluntary Red Army against Polish forces of General Józef Dałbor-Muśnicki in Belarus, White forces in the Don region, and newly independent Ukrainian forces as proof that the Red Army could successfully repel German forces, especially if propaganda and asymmetrical warfare were used. Lenin, who had earlier hoped for a speedy Soviet revolution in Germany and other parts of Europe, quickly decided that the imperial government of Germany was still firmly in control and that, absent a strong Russian military, an armed conflict with Germany would lead to a collapse of the Soviet government in Russia. He agreed with the left communists that ultimately a pan-European Soviet revolution would solve all problems, but until then the Bolsheviks needed to be able to survive and stay in power. Lenin didn't mind prolonging the negotiating process for maximum propaganda effect, but, from January 1918 on, he advocated signing a separate peace treaty if faced with a German ultimatum. Trotsky's position during this period was in between these two Bolshevik factions. Like Lenin, he admitted that the old Russian military, inherited from the monarchy and the provisional government and in advanced stages of decomposition, was unable to fight. Throughout January and February of 1918, Lenin's position was supported by 7 members of the Bolshevik Central Committee and Bukharin's by 4. Trotsky had 4 votes: his own, Felix Dzerzhinsky's, Nikolai Krestinsky's and Adolf Joff's, and, since he held the balance of power, he was able to pursue his policy in Brest-Litovsk. When he could no longer delay the negotiations, he withdrew from the talks on February 10, 1918, refusing to sign on Germany's harsh terms. The German side resumed military operations on February 18. Within a day, it became clear that the German army was capable of conducting offensive operations and that Red Army detachments, which were relatively small, poorly organized and poorly led, were no match for it. At this point, in the evening of February 18, 1918, Trotsky and his supporters in the Bolshevik Central Committee abstained. Lenin's proposal was accepted 7-4 and the Soviet government sent a telegram to the German side accepting the final Brest-Litovsk peace terms. The failure of the recently formed Red Army to resist the German offensive in February 1918 put its weaknesses on display. Insufficient numbers, lack of knowledgeable officers, almost complete absence of coordination and subordination. Celebrated and feared Baltic Fleet sailors, one of the bastions of the new regime led by Pavel Debenko, ignominiously fled from the German army at Narva. The notion that the Soviet state could have an effective voluntary or militia-type military was seriously undermined. On March 13, 1918, Trotsky's resignation as Commissar for Foreign Affairs was officially accepted and he was appointed People's Commissar of Army and Navy Affairs in place of Podvoisky and Chairman of the Supreme Military Council. The post of the Commander-in-Chief was abolished and from that point on, Trotsky was in full control of the Red Army, responsible only to the Communist Party leadership, their left socialist revolutionary allies having left the government over Brest-Litovsk. With the help of his faithful deputy Ephraim Skliansky, Trotsky spent the rest of the Civil War transforming the Red Army from a ragtag network of small and fiercely independent detachments into a large and disciplined military machine. Trotsky's managerial skills and his approach to building the Soviet military were soon put to a test. When the Czechoslovak legions, then en route from European Russia to Vladivostok, rose against the Soviet government in May to June 1918, the Bolsheviks were suddenly faced with the loss of most of the country's territory, an increasingly well-organized resistance by Russian anti-communist forces, usually referred to as the White Army after their best-known component, and widespread defection by the military experts that Trotsky relied on. Trotsky and the Soviet government responded with a full-fledged mobilization, which increased the size of the Red Army from less than 300,000 in May 1918 to 1 million in October 1918, and an introduction of political commissars into the Red Army. The latter were responsible for ensuring the loyalty of military experts, who were mostly former officers in the Imperial Army, and co-signing their orders. Facing military defeats in mid-1918, Trotsky introduced increasingly severe penalties for desertion, insubordination, and retreat. He organized the formation of the infamous blocking units, special squads stationed behind the frontline troops, whose role it was to summarily gun down all soldiers suspected of desertion and unauthorized retreat. In September 1918, the Soviet government, facing continuous military difficulties, declared what amounted to martial law and reorganized the Red Army. The Supreme Military Council was abolished and the position of the Commander-in-Chief was restored, filled by the commander of the Red Latvian Riflemen Joachim Vatsetis. Vatsetis was put in charge of day-to-day operations of the Red Army while Trotsky was appointed chairman of the newly formed Revolutionary Military Council of the Republic and retained overall control of the military. The reorganization caused yet another conflict between Trotsky and Stalin in late September, early October 1918 when the latter refused to accept former Imperial General Pavel Saitin, who had been appointed by Trotsky to command the Southern Front. As a result, Stalin was recalled from the South Front. Lenin and Yakov Sverdlov tried to get Trotsky and Stalin to mend fences, but their meeting was unsuccessful. Throughout late 1918 and early 1919, Trotsky had to fend off a number of attacks on his leadership of the Red Army, including veiled accusations in newspaper articles inspired by Stalin and a direct attack by the military opposition at the Eighth Party Congress in March 1919. On the surface, he weathered all of them successfully and was elected one of only 5 full members of the First Politburo after the Congress. By mid-1919, the Red Army had successfully defeated the White Army's spring offensive in the east and was about to cross the Urals Mountains and enter Siberia in pursuit of Admiral Alexander Kolchak's forces. In early 1920, Soviet-Polish tensions escalated to the point where they eventually led to the Polish-Soviet War, In the run-up to the war and during the hostilities, Trotsky argued that the Red Army was exhausted and that the Soviet government should sign a peace treaty with Poland as soon as possible. He also didn't believe that the Red Army would find much support in Poland proper. Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders, however, thought that the Red Army's successes in the Russian Civil War and against the Poles meant that, as Lenin said later, the defensive period of the war with worldwide imperialism was over, and we could, and had the obligation to, exploit the military situation to launch an offensive war. However, the Red Army offensive was stopped and turned back during the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920, in part because of Stalin's failure to obey Trotsky's orders in the run-up to the decisive engagements. Back in Moscow, Trotsky again argued in favor of signing a peace treaty and this time was able to prevail. In late 1921, Lenin's health deteriorated and his periods of absence from Moscow became longer and longer, eventually leading to 3 strokes between May 26, 1922 and March 10, 1923, which resulted in paralysis, loss of speech and finally death on January 21, 1924. With Lenin increasingly sidelined throughout 1922, Stalin, elevated to the newly created position of the Central Committee General Secretary earlier in the year, Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev formed a troika, triumvirate, to ensure that Trotsky, publicly the number 2 man in the country at the time and Lenin's heir presumptive, would not succeed Lenin. Lenin spent much of his time trying to devise a way to prevent a split within the Communist Party leadership, which was reflected in Lenin's testament. As part of this effort, on September 11, 1922, Lenin proposed that Trotsky become his deputy at the Sovnarkom. The Politburo approved the proposal, but Trotsky categorically refused. In the fall of 1922, Lenin's relationship with Stalin deteriorated over Stalin's heavy-handed and chauvinistic handling of the issue of merging Soviet republics into one federal state, the USSR. At that point, according to Trotsky's autobiography, Lenin offered Trotsky an alliance against Soviet bureaucracy in general and Stalin in particular. The alliance proved effective on the issue of foreign trade, but it was complicated by Lenin's progressing illness. In January 1923, the strained relationship between Lenin and Stalin completely broke down when Stalin rudely insulted Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya. At that point, Lenin amended his testament suggesting that Stalin should be replaced as the party's general secretary, although the thrust of his argument was somewhat weakened by the fact that he also mildly criticized other Bolshevik leaders, including Trotsky. In March 1923, days before the third stroke that put an end to his political career, Lenin prepared a frontal assault on Stalin's Great Russian Nationalistic Campaign against the Georgian Communist Party and asked Trotsky to deliver the blow at the 12th Party Congress. With Lenin no longer active, Trotsky did not raise the issue at the Congress. At the 12th Party Congress in April 1923, immediately after Lenin's final stroke, the key Central Committee reports on organizational and nationalities questions were delivered by Stalin and not by Trotsky, while Zinoviev delivered the political report of the Central Committee, traditionally Lenin's prerogative. Stalin's power of appointment had allowed him to gradually replace local party secretaries with loyal functionaries and thus control most regional delegations at the Congress, which enabled him to pack the Central Committee with his supporters, mostly at the expense of Zinoviev and Kamenev's backers. Trotsky was again sick and unable to respond while his opponents mobilized all of their resources to denounce him. They succeeded in damaging his military reputation so much that he was forced to resign as People's Commissar of Army and Fleet Affairs and Chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council on January 6, 1925. Zinoviev demanded Trotsky's expulsion from the Communist Party, but Stalin refused to go along and skillfully played the role of a moderate. Trotsky kept his Politburo seat, but was effectively put on probation. In the meantime, the Troika finally broke up. Bukharin and Rykov sided with Stalin while Krupskaya and Soviet Commissar of Finance Grigory Sokolnikov aligned with Zinoviev and Kamenev. The struggle became open at the September 1925 meeting of the Central Committee and came to a head at the 14th Party Congress in December 1925. With only the Leningrad Party organization behind them, Zinoviev and Kamenev, dubbed the New Opposition, were thoroughly defeated while Trotsky refused to get involved in the fight and didn't speak at the Congress. During a lull in the intra-party fighting in the spring of 1926, Zinoviev, Kamenev and their supporters in the new opposition gravitated closer to Trotsky's supporters, and the two groups soon formed an alliance, which also incorporated some smaller opposition groups within the Communist Party. The alliance became known as the United Opposition. The United Opposition was repeatedly threatened with sanctions by the Stalinist leadership of the Communist Party, and Trotsky had to agree to tactical retreats, mostly to preserve his alliance with Zinoviev and Kamenev. The opposition remained united against Stalin throughout 1926 and 1927, especially on the issue of the Chinese Revolution. The methods used by the Stalinists against the opposition were becoming more and more extreme. At the 15th Party Conference in October 1926, Trotsky could barely speak due to interruptions and catcalls, and at the end of the conference he lost his Politburo seat. In 1927, Stalin started using the GPU, Soviet secret police, to infiltrate and discredit the opposition. Rank-and-file oppositionists were increasingly harassed, sometimes expelled from the party and even arrested. In October 1927, Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the Central Committee. When the United Opposition tried to organize independent demonstrations commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1927, the demonstrators were dispersed by force and Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the Communist Party on November 12. Trotsky was exiled to Alma-Ata on January 31, 1928. He was expelled from the Soviet Union in February 1929, accompanied by his wife Natalia Sedova and his son Leon Sedov. After Trotsky's expulsion from the country, exiled Trotskyists began to waver and, between 1929 and 1934, most of the leading members of the opposition surrendered to Stalin, admitted their mistakes, and were reinstated in the Communist Party. Christian Rakovsky, who served as an inspiration for Trotsky between 1929 and 1934 while he was in Siberian exile, was the last prominent Trotskyist to capitulate. Almost all of them perished in the Great Purges just a few years later. Trotsky was deported from the Soviet Union in February 1929. His first station in exile was the Turkish island of Prinkipo off the Istanbul coast, where he stayed 4 years. In 1933, Daladier offered Trotsky asylum in France. He stayed first at Royan, then at Barbizon. He was not allowed to visit Paris. In 1935 it was implied to him that he was no longer welcome in France. After weighing alternatives, he moved to Norway, where he got permission from then Justice Minister Trygve Lie to enter the country. Trotsky was a guest of Konrad Knudsen near Oslo. After 2 years, allegedly under influence from the Soviet Union, he was put under house arrest. After consultations with Norwegian officials, his transfer to Mexico on a freighter was arranged. Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas welcomed him warmly, even arranging a special train to bring him to Mexico City from the port of Tampico. In Mexico he remained a prolific writer in exile, penning several key works, including his History of the Russian Revolution, 1930, and The Revolution Betrayed, 1936, a critique of the Soviet Union under Stalinism. Trotsky argued that the Soviet state had become a degenerated worker state controlled by an undemocratic bureaucracy, which would eventually either be overthrown via political revolution establishing workers' democracy or degenerate to the point where the bureaucracy converts itself into a capitalist class. While in Mexico, Trotsky also worked closely with James P. Cannon, Joseph Hansen, and Farrell Dobbs of the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States, as well as other supporters. Cannon, a longtime leading member of the American Communist movement, had supported Trotsky in the struggle against Stalinism since he first read Trotsky's criticisms of the Soviet Union in 1928. Trotsky's critique of the Stalinist regime, though banned, was distributed to leaders of the Comintern. Among his other supporters was Chen Du-shu, founder of the Chinese Communist Party. Trotsky eventually quarreled with Rivera and in 1939 moved into his own residence in Coyoacan, a neighborhood in Mexico City. On May 24, 1940, He survived a raid on his home by Stalinist assassins under the leadership of GPU agent Iosif Romualdovich Grigolovich, Mexican Stalinist painter David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Vittorio Vidal. On August 20, 1940, Ramon Mercader, a Stalinist agent, successfully attacked Trotsky in his home, driving the pick of an ice axe into Trotsky's skull. The blow was poorly delivered, however, and failed to kill Trotsky instantly, as Mercader had intended. Witnesses stated that Trotsky spat on Mercader and began struggling fiercely with him. Hearing the commotion, Trotsky's bodyguards burst into the room and nearly killed Mercader, but Trotsky stopped them, shouting, "Do not kill him. This man has a story to tell." Trotsky died the next day at a local hospital. According to Joseph Cannon, the secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, USA, Trotsky's last words were, "I will not survive this attack." Stalin has finally accomplished the task he attempted unsuccessfully before. Trotsky's house in Koyakon was preserved in much the same condition as it was on the day of the assassination and is now a museum run by a board of intellectuals, including his grandson Esteban Volkov. The current director of the museum is Dr. Carlos Ramirez Sandoval, under whose supervision the museum has improved considerably after years of neglect. Trotsky's grave is located on its grounds.